Welcome to Living Mirrors with Dr. James Cook. My guest this week is Liz Carlisle. Liz is an assistant professor in the Environmental Studies program at UC Santa Barbara, where she teaches courses on food and farming. She's the author of 3 books, Lentil Underground, Grain by Grain, and Healing Grounds, Climate, Justice, and the Deep Roots of Regenerative Farming, all of which explore regenerative agriculture and agroecology, which is what we talk about today. Hope you enjoy the conversation.
Okay, I'm here with Liz Carlisle. Liz, thanks for coming on the podcast.
Such a pleasure, James. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, you're very welcome. So you have a really interesting background that kind of took you to this point where you're working in regenerative agriculture. I wonder if you could share your story with people.
Yeah, it's true. It's been quite a winding path. But for me, it really starts with my grandmother, who actually lost our family farm in the Dust Bowl. There was this period in the United States, almost 100 years ago now, in the late 20s and early 30s, when a lot of people who had homesteaded lost their farms due to mismanagement of soil and not really understanding how to farm appropriately in this arid prairie. And my family was one of those families. And I loved my grandmother's stories about sort of growing up on land and having that connection to land. And I felt like she had this deep wisdom and groundedness that came from that experience. And I really wanted that for myself. And at the same time, she was honest with me about what it had been like to go through that Dust Bowl period and to lose everything, their livelihood, their home, and to see the community kind of disintegrate. And she really imbued me with this sense that we need to figure out how to properly care for land if we want to properly care for each other and sort of live good lives in community. And so that sort of planted the seed. I found myself really curious to talk to other farmers, other people with that kind of experience of a land-based livelihood and life. So I majored in folklore as a college student, and was really focused on that kind of rural American experience. And I also really loved music. So I ended up sort of doing the singer-songwriter thing and getting into country music, and had a career for a few years touring as an opening act for country artists. And that gave me the opportunity to hear from a lot of rural people and farmers around the United States whose experiences kind of started to show me that there were these common themes that were getting in the way of people's attempt to steward their land and grow good food for their communities, these kinds of economic and policy obstacles. And then an organic farmer from my home state of Montana ran for the United States Senate and got elected. He unseated a 3-term incumbent. It was just this amazing story of, a guy from a town of 300 people winning this big race. And I was so inspired when he talked about organic farming and the green economy as the solution to some of these problems I'd been hearing about that farmers all over the country were facing. I made this big career pivot. I applied for a job in that office and I got it. And so I was legislative correspondent for agriculture and natural resources. And I immediately realized that this farmer turned US Senator, John Tester, for anybody out there who's curious, wasn't just like a lone actor, that he had come out of this whole movement of farmers in Montana who saw that, industrial agriculture, commodity agriculture was a losing game. They were going to end up going bankrupt, and sort of developed an organic cropping rotation and these community-run businesses in order to shift to a different agriculture that was more ecological, and also where they got paid for the quality of their crops rather than just getting lowballed on the global market. So I met all these other people who were part of that movement through my job in the Tester office. And that ultimately led me to be really, really curious. I got invitations to visit farms, but here I was in Washington, D.C. So long story short, I went to grad school. I ended up collaborating with those folks. I ended up writing a book about it. And I just kind of got enmeshed in this community of organic agriculture. And now, ultimately what people are calling regenerative agriculture.
Right. And would you be able to kind of explain the difference to people between organic and regenerative agriculture?
Yeah, I mean, as you know, that's a big conversation, but in a nutshell, organic agriculture is concerned with the role of chemicals in industrial agriculture. And it calls out all of the problems that have stemmed from relying on chemical fertilizers and chemical pesticides and herbicides as the basis of growing food, particularly since World War II, when those approaches really scaled up because there was all of this chemical manufacturing capacity in the wake of the war and the munitions plants. And so the organic agriculture movement in the UK and in the US sort of started as this kind of small niche thing in, maybe the 40s, we could say is the origin point, and gained steam with the larger environmental movement in the 60s and 70s. Rachel Carson's Silent Spring came out. Consumers started getting concerned about pesticide residues in food. And then eventually, it sort of grew into this mass market phenomenon that it is now, where you have, certifications that are actually supported by governments. And you have these, multi-billion-dollar corporations that manufacture organic food. So that's kind of the trajectory of organic. And its key principle is, how do we grow food without these harmful chemicals? Now, in order to grow food without these harmful chemicals, of course, that means you have to rely on ecology. You have to rely on a healthy soil and actual living organisms in the soil, but also, things like pollinators for healthy crops to have fertility and to control pests without having to use chemicals. And that's kind of where the regenerative agriculture movement has picked up, is really focusing on how do we create those healthy farm ecosystems. And in recent years, there's a particular interest in the idea that a healthy soil can store carbon. And that's a way of maybe drawing down some carbon that's currently in the atmosphere back into the soil. And so regenerative agriculture has this big focus on the idea of agriculture being a climate solution.
Right. Yeah. And I think my impression is a lot of people think of soil almost as kind of like a mineral, like something inert and dead, and that, isn't really a living ecosystem, because it's most of what's going on isn't kind of, we can't see it with the resolution of our eyes. But in mainstream agriculture, often it is quite dead soil that's amended with chemical fertilizers, right, to make sure the plants can grow. But then you're left with all of the richness in terms of nutrition and nutrients that exist in the soil not really getting passed on into the food, right? And in the regenerative and organic mode, if we zoom in on the soil, are we talking about a real kind of microscopic ecosystem going on there?
Yeah, exactly. So, you just imagine like these millions and billions of soil organisms having all these interactions underground, that there's this whole ecological community that's like every bit of as complex and fascinating as, say, a rainforest, but because it's underground and we as humans typically don't see it, we're often just not even aware. And in many cases, science and scientists are just beginning to figure out, who these organisms are and how they function. So it is this kind of realm of some mystery and an area where there's a lot of research focusing. And you're right that whole world of organisms in the natural world is absolutely key to plant growth and plant health. So if you're a plant in the natural world and you need nitrogen, which is the key limiting nutrient for most plants, you're going to work with microbes in the soil to go scavenge that nitrogen for you. You're going to form a partnership. So you're going to exude carbon through your roots to those microbes to feed them sugar to keep them going metabolically. They in turn are going to scavenge nitrogen from the soil ecosystem. Some of them actually are also going to convert nitrogen into a form that the plant can use. If you're in a monocultural industrial farm and you're a plant, it's a whole different story. You're getting this nitrogen from a package, and it's not coming with all of the functions that you'd get alongside that biological nitrogen. You don't have microbial partners who are also at the same time helping you deal with stresses or diseases. There's all of these kind of holistic health functions that come with the biological strategy of being a plant and getting fertility and pest control that don't come with the strictly chemical strategy. So it's the chemical strategy is a very sort of short-term narrow thing. It's like, let's grow a plant for one season under ideal conditions. The biological strategy is more about how do we have an ecosystem that will persist under any conditions, drought, flood, climate change, and produce adequate food on an ongoing basis.
Right. Yeah. And I'm glad you said that about it being a very kind of narrow way of thinking, because it seems to me something that really brings all these things together is that the mainstream approach does seem to be very kind of linear reductionist. You know, if we want to achieve X, we're going to do Y. And, you know, if you need nitrogen in the soil, put some nitrogen in the soil, and then there you go. And that has all these kind of unintended consequences. And whereas if you work with the fact that we're actually, rather than being this kind of linear reductionist vision of how it's working, it's actually this complex, holistic, interdependent web of causality. To me, there are these two worldviews. And in your most recent book, you're kind of talking about how indigenous practices, you know, this regenerative agriculture stuff didn't spring out of nowhere, right? Out of people just kind of thinking rationally, what should we do? There's a kind of a long lineage of people knowing what are the wise ways to work with agriculture. So it seems to kind of fit with, there's this whole cultural context that goes along with it. And then to focus on the problems of the current way of doing things. I mean, I remember when I was an undergraduate at college, this UN report saying there were about 60 harvests left in the soil. I think that's what it was, like based on the current methods. I remember reading that and just thinking like, this is like someone saying, you know, a meteor is going to hit the Earth in 60 years, and no one seemed to care about it. No one seemed to be that bothered. It was kind of like it wasn't even front page on the science magazines. It was just kind of something that was in there. And yeah, it seems very, when you read something like that, it makes it very clear that I think we need to change course.
Absolutely. Yeah. And I think the issue is that for folks in the global north who have privilege and means, I think we're used to the idea that we don't need an ecologically functioning food system or farm because we've been replacing the functions of, you know, the natural ecosystem with chemicals and with technologies for decades now. You know, if you live in the US or the UK, you probably already eat a lot of food that came from a deeply impoverished ecosystem where most of the ecosystem functions were in fact provided by chemicals or some kind of human technology, irrigation, things like that. And so I think there's this kind of overconfidence in the global north that we can continue to provide whatever fertility our plants need, whatever pest control our plants need, and grow these extremely high yielding crops. I think the concerns come in when you start to ask, well, what's the nutritional value of those crops? And how well prepared are those crops for the kinds of uncertainty associated with climate change, like the droughts and the floods and the extreme weather events and the changes in temperature? And there's really good research showing that they're not as prepared, that without soil health, you get flooded fields in Iowa and Nebraska. You get huge drought issues in California, where I am. And so then, add to that, what about, lots of people who do not have access to these technologies and for whom paying for all these chemicals or irrigation is prohibitively expensive and also links them into geopolitical relationships that they may or may not want. For all those people, which I would suggest is the majority of the world, the ecosystem partner is key. And so I think, both from a just kind of reasonability standpoint, given climate change in the world we live in, and from an equity standpoint, we want to think about the health of our crops from the standpoint of how do we take care of the ecosystems that ensure the health of our crops, rather than how do we engineer more and more technology to try to solve the problems that we're simultaneously causing.
Right. Yeah. And it's so common in our culture to think, we have a goal and we're just going to fix that goal and trying to come with a technological solution, and that will usually cause side effects. So then we'll try and solve those, and at least this kind of freight train kind of running out of control situation that we currently have with the climate and with so many other issues. And I think when someone's thinking in that mode and they hear something like regenerative agriculture, and they hear that not only can it give us healthier food to make us more nutrient-packed food to make us more healthy, make the soil more healthy, be healing for the environment, sequester carbon for the atmosphere, be involved in kind of justice movements for communities. If you're selling it as another kind of technological package, it sounds too good to be true. It sounds like a magic bullet, right? But if you understand it as a kind of a correction to our worldview, like we're in this crazed, well, we're sick in our current strategy, and this is what a healthy way of being looks like. And lo and behold, when you're healthy, everything kind of falls into alignment. At least that's how I think about it.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely right, James. And I think one of the problems is we're in this kind of scarcity mindset in the way that we're used to looking at the world around us. I say we as far as, like maybe privileged folks in the global north. We're not used to imagining the world around us as something that we have a reciprocal relationship with. We're used to imagining, resources, natural resources, as something that we deplete over time, and not as something, we don't imagine these as like beings that we interact with in like this mutualistic circle. So it is this, I think, paradigm shift of what's possible.
Yeah, no, I'm very interested in, just as a side note, as a scientist who's interested in the mind, I think this particular time when Descartes was saying that, all life on all of nature is just a machine. It doesn't have a soul, it doesn't have an inner life. And that came along at the same time as the Dutch golden age of colonialism, when, they were bringing in vast amounts of material wealth into the country through plundering the earth. And so it's kind of not surprising that people who were benefiting from that narrative were like, hey, let's amplify this guy's voice. And it's not that it's a sane or correct worldview. I would argue that the kind of animistic, indigenous worldviews that recognize us as being part of nature are far more in line with things like Darwinian evolution. We know for a fact that we're not separate to the rest of nature, right? But I still think science is, even in my field of the mind, is kind of struggling to catch up with this. And it's sort of far more consequence when it comes to ecology. If we think we're truly separate and that it's okay for us to dominate nature, or if we think that it's not going to come back, and have negative consequences, it seems to be a truly kind of strange way of thinking. And actually, I wrote down a quote that when I was researching around this area for our interview, just before the Dust Bowl, I read this quote from the Bureau of Soils in 1909, which kind of reflects the mainstream thinking at the time in the US. And it says, the soil is the one indestructible, immutable asset that the nation possesses. It is the one resource that cannot be exhausted, cannot be used up, which is just a statement of just complete misunderstanding of how we're to relate to this living ecosystem. And then through the techniques that were being used, it was used up, right? And then you have this kind of destruction that was wrought as a result.
Yeah. And I think that word asset is just so telling, is that we're going to imagine the natural world as something that we're trying to extract and accumulate for the purpose of power. I mean, I think that in a nutshell is like,
Right.
That's why we're in a climate crisis. And it is very different from the idea of, we're going to imagine the non-human world around us as this whole web of beings with whom we're going to interact on an ongoing basis. And there's kind of no like something to achieve, or like it's just ongoing. It's an ongoing relationship. I think that is a very hard thing to imagine if your mind is really set on the idea of an asset, or say if you live a life that's structured by the idea of assets, right? Like if you have a mortgage, or I think that's one of the hard things, is that this way of thinking has become imbued in so many of the structures that so many of us have to interact with just to get through our daily lives. And so a lot of the folks that I spoke to for this book, that's what they're working to do around land, is to find ways for people to experience a relationship with land that's not just property, that's not just an asset, but that really is this living being that you interact with.
Right, and you've read about buffalo in the new book, right? And there was an interesting thing you were pointing out about how in the way we think of, just dealing with these things as resources or assets, but actually when there are indigenous communities that see the buffalo as, I can't remember what term you used, but almost as kin or a relation, or there's some established connection there, that actually, that it needs to be respected, and we need to be seeing it from their perspective, as well as kind of taking on their wisdom in how to work in these ways.
Yeah. I spoke with Latrice Tatsy from Blackfeet Nation in current Northwest Montana for this book, and she works on buffalo restoration. Interestingly, her family also ranches cattle, which is something that a lot of indigenous people in the Great Plains of the US have done as a way to kind of adapt to this very oppressive colonialism. Cattle ranching is something that sort of fit into the strictures of colonial governance, and yet allowed for indigenous people to continue traditional land relationships to some extent. And so anyway, she enters this field of regenerative grazing, and she's a scientist who's a graduate student at Montana State University. She's looking at soil carbon sequestration in cattle pastures compared to buffalo pastures. And she enters this conversation fully aware that there are cattle ranchers talking about it, and also that there's buffalo restoration folks talking about it. And I've spoken with a lot of different sort of advocates for the idea of regenerative grazing before, which in a nutshell is the idea that, okay, in a prairie ecosystem, historically, you had native herbivores that evolved with the vegetation, and they moved long distances and they would graze really heavily, but then they would leave, and that vegetation would be stimulated to grow back, and it would have time to grow back before those herbivores came back. And so if you hear the phrase regenerative grazing now in the US and the UK, it's mostly people who ranch cattle who are trying to learn from that model of native herbivores to inform the way in which they do rotational grazing, usually with electric fences to kind of keep the cattle in one area for a while and then move them around. But talking with Latrice, she emphasized this idea of buffalo as a relation, as you were saying, and also as a teacher. And so she really cautioned me against thinking about buffalo just as like a conceptual model, which is typically how they're invoked in the regenerative grazing conversation as something that used to be on the landscape. And her point is really like, no, we actually need buffalo, ini in her language and Blackfeet language. We need these relatives back here on their homelands, because they continually teach us how to relate to this landscape. And so she, as a cattle producer, she wants to see bison in her immediate area to continually inform how she should graze, as things change with climate change, as, buffalo can adapt to that, and she can continue to learn. And there's also these deeper lessons about, sort of how to make the most of what's seasonally available on the landscape, that people can learn from in much, much deeper ways in terms of how we build our livelihoods or how we associate with land. And so that really struck me, is that you can't just use buffalo as a concept. That actual buffalo, that actual being, is central to this kind of sustainable balance with land.
Right. And in your, I love this theme that you explore of the way that you can't kind of just treat regenerative agriculture as a kind of a technical solution, but it necessarily brings you into thinking about social relations, our relations with not just with animals, but with each other. And I think it was in your previous book, Lentil Underground, where you talk about these communities that kind of revived their farms through organic agriculture. And you talk about this thing, that the triple bottom line, instead of just profit, there's people, planet, and profit. But in addition to that, you talk about the kind of, that it inherently is linked up to this kind of social movements that really are interested in equity and learning from each other and justice, and that it's not possible to to just treat it as this kind of nice little package, because you're inherently thinking kind of through time as to planning how you're going to kind of rotate your crops, and through learning from others. And I wonder if you could speak to that.
Yeah, I mean, that's a great point about planning through time, because the big question that often gets asked of advocates of regenerative agriculture, so there's folks right now like lobbying the US Congress to include carbon credits in major new legislation and pay farmers to sequester carbon. And the idea is either you're going to pay them for a particular set of practices, like planting soil building cover crops or reducing tillage. And then you're going to have these measurement techniques. This kind of new genomic science is going to help you determine whether the carbon is actually going into the soil, and you can measure the soil organic carbon. And what the skeptics often ask is like, okay, great. We can pay farmers for putting carbon in the soil, but it's only a climate win if it stays there. And how do we know it stays there for 10 years, 30 years, 50 years, 100 years, right? The farmer's dead. Did anybody in their family take on the farm? Did those people have the same priorities? And if we're talking about climate, we're actually talking about like thousands of years. And so what does it take to confidently, say, oh yeah, my culture is going to continue to manage land in a way that's going to be consistent with carbon sequestration? That takes more than like some genomic science. That's where it requires, I think, these really deep principles of reciprocal relationships with land. And the kind of things I hear, when I talk to folks at Blackfeet Nation, for example, or Indigenous communities around the world, is that level of commitment that comes from truly not seeing a distinction between your own health, your own life force, and the health and life force of the land.
Right. And on the issue around climate change and sequestering carbon, I find it kind of amazing. It seems so. When you first hear about it, I guess I was trying to learn the kind of technicalities of how it works, but then I think for people, maybe a simple insight is that, when you see healthy soil, it looks black, right? And if you think of that we're carbon-based life forms. And so if you, in the same way that, charcoal and these other carbon-based things are black, that if you have a healthy soil with mycelium from fungi and microscopic organisms and decomposing plant matter, all of that has to come from the atmosphere, or come from nature around, and then the carbon exists in the living bodies of the organisms. And then it's if that continues to exist as a surviving system, it's sequestered there, right? And so I've seen statistics that this process of regenerative agriculture could, in theory, fully offset the amount of carbon that we put into the atmosphere, which is an incredible possibility. Whereas at the moment, I think, I read you say that it's a quarter to a third of our carbon output currently comes from agriculture. So it seems like we have this thing that's pumping carbon into the atmosphere when actually it could be removing it.
Yeah. And I think the sort of ambitious estimate that I look at in terms of how much could regenerative agriculture offset climate emissions, I would look at the 4 per mil study, which was a huge international team of scientists. The French government got involved in a big way. Prince Charles actually got involved in a big way. And they continue to meet annually at the Conference of Parties, at the COP meetings. But they published this paper, the 4 per mil study. And the reason they call it that is the idea is 0.4% of sort of increasing soil carbon on agricultural land around the world. They calculated, I think the figure was something like 20 to 35% in terms of how much of human emissions could be offset. So I think that's a good kind of people in the scientific community wouldn't say it's a conservative figure, because for the scientific community, it's ambitious. But I think because of the way, sort of they work as a team of scientific researchers, I think they've sort of taken the appropriate caveats to heart. But you're right. There are a number of organizations that promote organic and regenerative agriculture that feel like, with a really deep shift, we could in fact offset 100% of human emissions. I don't know about that, but at the same time, I think that if we really shifted our society's relationship with land, that would actually affect other sectors too. So I'm kind of on board with the idea that we would sort of undo climate change if we took this seriously, but not just because of soil carbon getting sequestered on agricultural lands, but also people in relationship with those lands in a way that changes what the energy sector looks like, that changes what the transportation sector looks like, because you have you have a land community, as Aldo Leopold said.
Right. Yeah. I can't. It. We were saying, if you could sequester all the amount that's put out by our current industrial processes, I can't imagine a world in which you have regenerative agriculture, for the most part over the world, but then we're still spewing out exactly the same amount of carbon. That those two worldviews seem so at odds with each other that I think it's going to be a kind of, we're going to collapse into one or the other. We're going to stay the course of the kind of the crazed growth model, or move into a more kind of healing model. Yeah, and I think you're right that there would be knock-on effects where if the communities that would be living in relationship to the land wouldn't be presumably producing as much carbon. And I mean, there's this other issue of if we just consider the organic side of things, where if we try and get away from chemical fertilizers, which contribute to putting out carbon into the atmosphere, there's debate around whether organic agriculture could feed the global population, because obviously the whole point of the mainstream method is to be as productive as possible to a fault, where like you're being so overproductive that you're damaging the system. So it wouldn't be surprising if organic agriculture did produce less food overall. But then there's things, I guess, like if people move towards vegetarianism, and you could use grazing land more efficiently, right, for and reducing food waste. And whenever I see debate around this, the people who are pushing back often seem to say things like, "Oh, like that's unlikely that we're gonna reduce food waste and move into the direction of more vegetarianism, so we should just stay the course," not seeming to factor that staying the course involves presumably collapse of lots of systems, famines, and God knows how bad it could get. And there's almost like I'm not sure what the term would be for it, but somehow the status quo, because it feels familiar, it's like we discount those things, or people don't seem to factor them in. But yeah, what's your thoughts on? I assume you were optimistic that we could roll this out in a way where it could support the kind of global food system.
Yeah, you made so many great points about food security there, James. So I think the kind of primary thing to understand that's quite surprising, or at least it was to me, is that actually the sort of current dominant industrial food system does a woefully poor job of producing global food security. So, we have literally billions of people whose nutritional needs are not being met by this system. And it's just tremendously wasteful. I mean, in the global north, there's like, a third of the food is wasted, mostly sort of later in the food supply chain. So ugly produce that gets, rejected from supermarkets, or things that go past their date at supermarkets, even though they're perfectly edible for another week. And all the waste in our consumer refrigerators, and the waste sort of catering and restaurants and all that. I mean, it's like a third of the food that gets wasted. And then in the global south, it's also a third of the food that gets wasted. And that mostly has to do with lack of access to, refrigerated transportation and appropriate infrastructure to actually get the food from the farm to the market. So our current system is incredibly wasteful and very bad at producing food security. And you ask, like, why is that? Why would anybody design a food system that is not very good at feeding people? And the answer is that it wasn't about that. It really was about sort of producing these capital assets. It's very much a legacy of colonialism. It's producing wealth very well for agribusiness corporations and for the financial sector. And it's also producing geopolitical power. And that is what it was set up to do. And so if we want a food system that's about producing food security, and if we also care about environmental and public health, like you said, if we don't want to produce all these costs that we then have to pay for in other ways around water quality and public health issues like diabetes and all these other externalities of the food system, then we do have to think about, how would we set up a food system that's actually designed around producing, nutritionally dense, healthy food, culturally appropriate, and good for the environment. And that's going to be a much more regional and local food system. It's not going to be like, oh, we're going to focus on just a handful of commodities. We're going to grow the heck out of them and then ship them around the world. And they're going to be sort of interchangeable, almost like some kind of factory raw material. Instead, it's going to be, people producing foods that grow well in their area, that are consistent with their cultural foods. And as you said, the plant-based protein thing is an important piece of it, because one of the things that's been so wasteful about the development of the industrial food system is how much prime farmland, like the US Midwest, man, like those mollisols, these incredibly, talk about like dark soil that's full of carbon. You can grow anything there. My mom grew up there. She's like, you don't even water your garden. You just like stick the seed in the ground and wham, you have vegetables. But instead, we're using that land to grow feed grain. And when that feed grain goes through an animal at a concentrated animal feeding operation, 90% of the caloric energy is lost because it's going through an animal. And so much of our potential to utilize our agricultural land to meet our food security needs is sort of dying right there in this extreme marketing of meat products that has gradually risen the meat consumption in the global north in particular over the last few decades. So you're right. We don't have an issue with feeding the world. It's perfectly reasonable to feed the world with organic and regenerative approaches. We have an issue with a supply chain that's super inefficient and has a lot of distribution problems because its goal isn't people being fed.
Right. Yeah. I guess some of the criticisms maybe it shouldn't be so much that we need to completely be able to replicate the current system with organic food and waste precisely the same amount. The aim shouldn't be to produce so much that we can waste a lot. There should be, based again. This brings us back to the thing that this is not just a technical fix. It's a worldview where we prioritize people being fed, and that it's kind of sounds crazy to as you correctly point out, that's actually not the incentivizing factor in the economies that produce food. It's profit and wealth creation, and you without thinking about it, you might just instinctively assume, well, we make food to feed people, but there's this perverse incentive where that's not really what's driving forward. And you linked it to colonialism, and you write in a new book about this kind of tradition of Black liberation movements in the Americas as well, and ways of working with the land. Maybe you could share a bit about that.
Yeah. So I had this incredible conversation with Latrice Tatsy about buffalo restoration that helped me appreciate indigenous regenerative agriculture. Obviously just people wouldn't use that term. They didn't need that term because they didn't have industrial agriculture, but indigenous food systems that deeply inform regenerative agriculture. Then I also learned in researching this book about indigenous regenerative agriculture systems that have roots in Africa and that are practiced throughout the African diaspora in a lot of really interesting and important ways. And one of the things that really stuck out to me is the long, deep history of trees and agroforestry as really important food plants in African and African diaspora communities, and the ways in which people have really developed these complex agroforestry systems. And so I spoke with a woman named Olivia Watkins, she's actually forest farming in North Carolina on land that her family has had for 130 years. So she, as a young person, got really excited about farming and apprenticed on a bunch of farms and worked in Hawaii. And then simultaneously, she kind of had heard stories about how her family had this land in North Carolina and her grandma was taking care of it. She had been raised in New York State. Anyway, her grandma was getting older and it was harder for her to kind of take care of the land. And so Olivia, in her early 20s, agreed to sort of carry on her family's legacy with this forested plot of land. And for her grandma and for her family, what was really important about this land was her ancestor had bought it in 1890 and had become one of the first Black landowners in the area. And during a century, in the 20th century, 98% of Black agricultural landowners lost their land because of just a whole host of horrible violence and financial racism. And Olivia's family had managed to hang on to that land. And it had provided really important sanctuary, a safe space during a really racist time. And so it had a really important meaning for the family. And it was this place that was conserving Black-owned land. And then at the same time, Olivia, who had studied soil carbon sequestration in school, she felt like it was really important as a sanctuary for wildlife and for soil carbon because the Raleigh-Durham Triangle area was urbanizing. And this was one of the last remaining plots of forest like this in the area. And so she decided to take this on and to actually grow mushrooms in the understory of the forest rather than cutting it down as this way of simultaneously conserving threatened Black-owned land and conserving threatened wildlife habitat and soil carbon habitat. So she talked about conservation in these two senses. And then as I was sort of looking at this history of Black diaspora agroforestry, I was really struck by how many instances there were of Black people allying with trees and forests in the path to liberation. So from like these dooryard gardens that enslaved people would plant near their residences for subsistence food and for, bringing cultural foods from Africa to the Americas, to like Harriet Tubman, who, famous leader of the Underground Railroad, leading enslaved people to freedom. Part of the way she managed that is because she knew the woods so well, and she knew about the medicines that grew in the woods, and she knew about the culinary plants, and she knew about how to be safe in the woods. And then all the way up to like in the Reconstruction era after the abolition of slavery, when there was still all these kind of like economic strategies to try to keep people in similar conditions. In the American South, George Washington Carver gets hired at Tuskegee University, this famous historically Black college, and he starts doing all this research on compost, informed by the processes that he sees going on in the woods to create biological fertility, specifically because he understands that newly developed commercial fertilizers that are being marketed in the early 20th century, and that most of his scientific colleagues are really excited about, that if the Black sharecroppers that he is serving end up having to buy those, that's going to put him in debt to white planters and just continue this cycle of oppression. And so he really sees composting and regenerative agriculture essentially as a key path to economic liberation for Black people. And then you have, during the civil rights movement, you have Fannie Lou Hamer and the Freedom Farm. And all these stories about how Black landowners and Black food producers are key to sort of providing sanctuary and safe space and like feeding this movement. So most of this I learned from Monica White's book, Freedom Farmers, and it just really struck me how ecological agriculture and trees and agroforestry in particular are not only something that Black folks have contributed to the regenerative agriculture movement, but in this way that makes clear this connection between regeneration and liberation.
Right. Yeah, it definitely seems that there's this, again, this, and always struck again by just this very striking difference in worldview, that you have the social oppression and the plunder of the earth on one side, and the kind of resistance to that and the keeping of these kind of healthy traditions ecologically on the other side. Yes, it's fascinating, this kind of the cultural links. And you mentioned that there's this kind of economic dimension that I think it's worth emphasizing that when people promote regenerative agriculture, they're not asking farmers just to kind of do the right thing and take an economic hit and, just make life hard on themselves. If you don't have to buy fertilizer because you're making your own through composting, there are benefits as well, right? And there can be more security in your land over time as well.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, the only reason that regenerative agriculture isn't sort of economically an option for all farmers in the United States has to do with the way that we subsidize agriculture in the United States. And in fact, many farmers in our major agricultural regions, like the US Midwest, their primary source of income is payments from the government. And those payments are currently structured in a way that's a legacy of the commodity food payments that people received in the mid 20th century that emphasize monocultures of corn, soy, wheat, cotton, and rice. And what's just perverse about this is that people understand that they will continue to get those payments if they continue to plant those crops, even if the way in which they're doing it, combined with the current climate, like the literal climate, is making it more and more likely that their crops will actually fail. They plant them knowing that they're likely to fail, but knowing that they're incredibly likely to get a very what shall I say, generous insurance payment subsidized by the government. And so that's why it makes economic sense for so many farmers in the United States to keep doing what they're doing instead of a more regenerative approach, is that our subsidy structure is all wrong. And also historically, we have so generously subsidized these large-scale corporations that sell the agricultural inputs and that process agricultural goods that are produced in this way. They've sort of capitalized and built on the capital that came from those historical subsidies. So you have this legacy of older subsidies that's already kind of built into the structure of the whole sector. So you not only need to change the existing subsidies so that they better support public goods, like caring for the environment and producing healthy food. That's what we should be paying farmers to do. But you also have to invest in ways that counter that historical investment in the food system we have, because otherwise, those corporations and their incentives to continue to kind of build on the capital that they have aren't going to go anywhere.
Right. And so in the current system, if someone has a crop that they want to harvest and they're using these techniques where there can be a lot of crop failure, there are multiple things that they're going to want to ward off, right? At a kind of microscopic level, you could have diseases that consume the crop and so they can't harvest it, or insects could come after it, or weeds could, be growing alongside it that they don't want there. What are the kind of ways that in regenerative agriculture you can structure the ecosystem so that these things are kind of mitigated without just going in with the blunt kind of, I'm going to destroy them with a chemical method?
Yeah, I mean, I think at the heart of a regenerative approach to agriculture, and this is so much informed by indigenous food systems, is the idea that any farm should basically be a mimic of the ecosystem in which it's embedded. So if you farm and you're embedded in a prairie ecosystem, so I'm from Montana, that's my experience, you want your farm to look as much like a prairie as possible. So buffalo is basically like, that's awesome. That's about as good as it gets. You literally have the native ecosystem and you are, sort of hunting protein off of that ecosystem and harvesting some native plants. Cattle is sort of one step, maybe more a little bit modified and managed from that, but it's the same kind of thing. You can still potentially have sort of native prairie plants and a prairie ecosystem. If you're farming grain, the Land Institute is working on trying to develop a perennial grain. So it's not just this annual plant that, you have to harvest and take off the land every year. If you're not doing that, how about a winter cover crop? So maybe you have an annual grain and you harvest it, but instead of leaving the soil bare for the winter, which means the microbes won't have any food from plant roots, in order to ensure your microbes keep getting fed, you plant something in the winter that's just for feeding the soil. So those are all sort of strategies for creating a farm that mimics a prairie. And then there's another set of strategies if you live in an ecosystem that was historically forest. You're going to think about how do you incorporate trees and woody perennials, or maybe you're in a wetland. And so you're going to create a functional wetland ecosystem that you can produce food from. So that's kind of the basic idea, is a regenerative farm is one that functions as much like the ecosystem it's embedded in as possible.
Right. And things like planting, cover crops that aren't necessarily going to be, kind of by definition aren't going to be harvested for sale, but you're planting them to kind of manage the system. Do they also have other benefits, right? Like the root system leading to kind of greater water storage?
Yeah, cover crops are so awesome. I love cover crops. Sometimes my students are like, oh, Professor Carlisle, can we talk about something else already? But yeah, I mean, so you plant this one, ideally mixed cover crop of a bunch of species that you've chosen specifically for your system, and you get all these things out of it. So you get soil carbon, you get that soil carbon that you can use immediately for your crop the next year, but also some that's going to get stored more deeply. You get, as you said, with that soil carbon, also better water holding capacity in that soil, so that over time you can store, say, winter moisture in a place like California, and it'll hang on even if you have a long summer drought. Or you also want soil water holding capacity if you have some kind of a huge rain event. That way you can actually take up that moisture into your soil and actually use it later on, rather than having all these pools of water all over your field and you lose your whole crop. So you get those things. You also get added biodiversity, which is going to break up pest and disease cycles. You're going to have some new families of plants in there, compared to your cash crop. And so that's going to help make sure that whatever likes to kind of munch on the roots of your cash crop or the leaves doesn't have like a nice, happy place to hang out with the food that it wants for a little while, because there's something else there. So you're going to disrupt those cycles. And you might also, when it flowers, you might get some benefit for beneficial insects and for pollinators. You're going to want to make sure that you plow it under before it goes to seed, because otherwise it's still going to be there when you're trying to plant your cash crop, and that can be very annoying. So, you have to watch not to keep that flowering period going too long. But yeah, you just basically get all of these ecosystem benefits from this one cover crop.
Right. And to go from the kind of more zoomed in technical stuff to the big zoomed out picture, I'm interested kind of how you personally, being in touch with this movement, how optimistic you are, or like what you're seeing happening when it comes to this transition to regenerative agriculture, because it seems like there are so many forces that are keeping the current system going. Yeah, what's your feeling at the moment about where we're moving with this, and are you optimistic?
Yeah, I am. I'm a possibilist. I love Francis Moore Lepay's phrase there, is that I don't think this is going to happen on its own. So I'm not optimistic in the sense of like, I can just go to sleep and I'll wake up tomorrow and it'll be regenerative agriculture because it's just inevitable that this process is in motion. That's not true, but I see the possibility for it. And I know from my study of history that most of the big necessary historical shifts in the right direction for equity and for, care of land were tough, and they looked like outside shots when people got started on them. But ultimately they're very much in process. And so that's what we've got to do. We've got to shift our society's relationship with land, and the stakes couldn't be higher. Our survival depends on it. But I think more than that, I don't want to focus so much on that. I think what I want to focus on is the quality of the human experience and the quality of what it means to be alive on this planet. And what kind of sense of meaning are we deriving from our life here? And who are we? And have we sort of accessed our potential of what we can do in this lifetime? I know those are all questions that you and your listeners are interested in. And to be honest, that's probably why I'm in the field of regenerative agriculture, is all of those questions, because regardless of how long I live, or, if I quote unquote help to save the planet, I feel like I have a more fulfilling life if I reach toward a reciprocal relationship with land and with non-human beings. And it connects me with a really, really long time scale. And I'm not so invested in just only what happens within my lifetime, because of course this is going to take longer than my lifetime. And I feel a connection to these organisms that died a long time ago that are now providing fertility in my garden. And I feel a connection to these beings that will be alive many, many years in the future, who might just possibly have a better shot at living because of something that we all do now.
Right. Yeah, very well said. And I think that idea that, the current approach is coming, seems to be, coming to its own logical endpoint, where it's not sustainable anymore. And when we talk about these things, I guess someone hearing it for the first time might think that we're prescribing kind of hand-wringing and anxious, kind of like, oh no, it's, catastrophizing. But actually, to me, it's like it's an invitation to wake up and kind of snap out of our kind of collective psychosis and live well and kind of come back into the present and learn to be in relationship with each other and the land, and just to really come alive again, instead of living in this growth forward planning psychosis of just plundering everything for short-term gain as we charge into the future.
Yeah, I think that's really well said. And I have to say, it really came home for me during the pandemic when I was teaching on Zoom. And I was working with all these college students who had a variety of situations, but there were some people that literally were isolated in a room, like international students who were living in a dorm room. They had no access to family. They had very little access to friends. All of their conversations were mediated by Zoom. And obviously that's a really potentially traumatic experience. And we read Braiding Sweetgrass in my class in 2021 when we were all online. And the whole assignment was basically like, go outside and use this book, not just as use it as a lab manual. Robin Wall Kimmerer is giving you all of these ways to connect with the non-living world around you. And they're going to save us all from going completely stark raving crazy right now. And it was helpful, it was helpful to students. It was helpful to me. And I think it really brought home, even in non-pandemic times, we live in this state of somewhat isolation from all of the relationships that we could be having, that give our lives more meaning. And so it really instilled in me this commitment to make sure that I don't miss out on those relationships with the cute little snowy plovers that are being restored on the beach near my house. And, everybody around us, we're never alone.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much for your time. It's been really great. I really recommend the new book, Healing Grounds, which is out now. And is there anywhere else you would send people to if they want to look into your work more?
Yeah. So I have a website. It's lizcarlisle.com. And more than anything, I just encourage you to scope out the work of the folks who are featured in the book. I just barely scratch the surface of all the awesome stuff they're doing.
Yeah. Well, thank you again.
Thank you so much, James.
Thanks for listening. If you're watching on YouTube, please like and subscribe. And if you want to help the podcast reach a wider audience, you can leave a review on Apple Podcasts. Finally, if you want to offer financial support, you can go to patreon.com/Dr. James Cook.